And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told him what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So how about that, honey? What are your first thoughts?
Oh, well.
Well read.
Thank you. First of all, I have to say that if I had to pick a favorite resurrection story, this would be my favorite. I love it. I love its realness of two people taking a walk and wrestling with so much that has happened, and then just that they find that Jesus, even though they don't recognize him, Jesus is along with them on that walk. I just love that.
Yeah, the Lord, I agree. And walking on the puddle here, the Lord initiating, reaching out, coming alongside and walking. Isn't that a beautiful image?
Yes.
Think about when we have struggles or a down day and we don't know like what in the world is going on. You know, we're having trouble sort of staying afloat as we try to interpret reality, and as these guys were, and these guys were having a hard time. And there, he just came with them. He came with them and he walked with them and engaged them in relationship. And that is a beautiful, encouraging picture of God. You want to use this as our, I'll turn this around here up here. It's a wonderful, beautiful picture of God. It's a God who initiates in relationship. Be careful, don't fall in the water. The God who initiates in relationship, even as we, that's nice. Even as we struggle to figure it all out. And especially now during a pandemic, you know, how many people are kind of walking and sort of having a sort of similar conversation, like, Lord, what's
going on in our world right now?
Yeah, we did not expect this. And I think, so even though it's not particularly about Christ's death and resurrection, it is kind of about great struggle or unexpected struggle or pain or calamity. And this was a sort of a similar calamity back then. And I think what we get right away is we can't get to guidance or wisdom or discernment about calamities and struggles on our own. That God has to initiate with us. And God does so. That's what just so John and I am about this passage, that God does so. God takes care of us and initiates relationally to reveal himself. Now, notice it doesn't happen right away. It happens in a process, in a relationship. But I love that about the passage. I love the relationality of it. I love the process of it. But through this moment we're in, I think the message for us today, God wants to initiate with us in the process of what is happening to discern just what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, here they were wrestling with events. They were talking about what had happened, just as we may be wrestling with events. And Jesus wants to hear it from their perspective. You know, he sort of says, you know, tell me about it. And
what's up? Tell me what's up. What's on your mind?
And so he wants to hear from us and our wrestling with it. But then he speaks into it and gives us perspective. Through his presence with us through the scriptures, he brings perspective and shapes our way of understanding.
That's really good. That I love that, Jill, that he, you know, Jesus wants to meet you as you. Like, what's on your mind? You know, if you're, I think of the, you know, the Republican who has a response to all that's going on has stuff on their mind. The Democrat has stuff on their mind. The person who's apolitical has stuff on their mind. The former soldier who, as a combat vet, has stuff on their mind. The physician has stuff on their mind. The mom
who's trying to
has stuff on their right, exactly. You know, everyone has, the point being, everyone has their perspective. And I think one of the beautiful things of the passage, you just nailed it, is that Jesus asks and engages. And I think God is like that. Not that God doesn't know. God can know and perceive what's in our hearts. But God, like our Father, says, go into your room, like Jesus says when he talks about prayer, go into your room and pray to your Father who's in secret. and your Father will reward you or engage you. Not because the Father doesn't know what we think, because God wants to be in a relationship with us. So there's a relationship. So we want you out of this passage in this calamitous time to know that God wants to be in relationship with you and wants to walk with you and help you interpret what's going on from precisely your perspective, and don't try to do it on your own.
Amen.
Because every perspective has limits. Every perspective has its gifts. And that's what happened to these guys. They had the immediate perspective of being Israelites. That was their milieu, their setting. They saw it as, they saw him as, a failed political figure. And they were wrestling with it because it looked like a failure. They had a particular perspective. Every perspective has its gifts and its limits. So all those perspectives I mentioned have their gifts, and we need to listen to all of them, and all of them have their limits. And we need God to break in and show us in the context of a relationship what's going on. And in particular, what does it mean? How is God working on our salvation? St. Paul says, what does he say? Work out your salvation, for does God work in you, And the salvation is a gift, and we work in God's power for that, right? It's a gift. We believe it's a total gift. It's nothing in us that can save us. But work out God's work in you. But everyone's doing that comes out of their own limits and their own struggles of their own setting, right? We all have our own issues. And Jesus met these guys in their issues, and he'll meet you in your issues and your limits and blow them wide open.
Yeah, and to think about how they were wrestling, you could say intellectually, because they were trying to make sense of what had happened and what Jesus had taught them, and how does it make sense now. But also they were wrestling emotionally with grief. They just lost their beloved teacher and Lord. But then they also had hope that was trying to push in, where they'd heard that the women had seen Jesus, and they're wanting to believe it and hope, but they're not sure what to think. So they've just got a lot in their minds and hearts that they're wrestling with, and Jesus meets them right there. And I love that, even before they knew that it was Jesus, they just longed to be with him more. And
they want him to stay. They're like, hey, stay a while.
They want him to stay. Their hearts are burning within them. That's they say later. And then I think what's beautiful too is how Jesus is made known to them in something so ordinary, the breaking of bread, and yet something so sacred in our as Christians, communion, Eucharist. But I think that that's something for us today too, is where in our days, as right now in some ways things are simpler, right? And so where in the simple things of daily life, locked down with our families, or by ourselves, or in whatever situation we are, in the simple acts of eating bread, of having breakfast, of having dinner, or other ordinary events, where does Christ want to meet us in that? Where does he want to open our eyes to see that he's present with us in this?
Yeah, that's right. And he's committed to do that. He shows up, and just like he does in the story. And what is so powerful is the turn that occurs. You look at their trajectory out of that encounter, Jill, that you described so beautifully, that's purely on God's initiative, and their enlightenment and awareness. I don't like enlightenment, it sounds too heady, but they're becoming into a fuller awareness, a fuller head heart awareness of what God's up to. They get stoked, they get fired up. They go from being bummed out, and they say, were not our hearts on fire when he was explaining to us everything going on?